You have to accept the fact that there is a God.
A fact is a point of data that is objectively verifiable, known to be true. Something you and I can both look up or otherwise confirm. God is not a fact. God is a baseless assertion, merely an opinion, a belief that is widely held for different reasons, none of them good, because it is not backed up by any actual factual data nor logically valid arguments either. And this is what bothers me about religion the most. Circular arguments routing back to an already assumed conclusion that is baseless and must never be critically examined. That's the question-begging fallacy, which is ubiquitous throughout all religious beliefs. And not only is that illogical, but asserting baseless speculation as if it was a matter of fact is dishonest, too. Religious faith is all about pretending to know things you don't know, things no one even can know. But everywhere outside of religion, we call that lying. You have to accept the fact that God is not a fact. It's just something a lot of people like to believe.
So what about the Bible then? Is the Bible true?
There is precious little in the Bible that even could be true, and even less that has been confirmed, especially when we get into the murky depths of the Old Testament, where almost nothing fits. Yes, there are countries called Ethiopia and Egypt, and there probably was a King David at some point, too. So some of the people and places are real, but almost none of the important stories are true. We know for certain that there was never a global flood of Noah's Ark. Likewise, even Christian biologists admit that Adam and Eve are genetically impossible, and that the fable of the Garden of Eden does not fit the evidence. The only possible truth to that story, the only truth that there can be to that story is symbolic, as if it's read as a metaphorical fable. If you read it literally, then it's entirely false, with not even a kernel of truth to it at all.
Well, let's think about it. You got 66 books written by 40 different authors on 3 continents over a span of 1,600 years, and many of them didn't even know each other, yet they all tell their own portion of the very same story throughout history.
I'm here with Josh Bowen. He got a Bachelor of Science in Religion from Liberty University back when he was definitely a strong believer. And then he got a Master of Theology in the Old Testament from Capital Bible Seminary, at which point it seems he learned enough about biblical history that he just couldn't believe in it anymore. This happens a lot to seminary students. When you learn enough about the origins of the Bible that you realize that it cannot be the God-inspired, God-breathed, infallible word of God, that it is instead the words of mere fallible men. But Josh continued with his education, getting at the roots of Semitic religions with an MA in Near Eastern Studies from Johns Hopkins. Then he went even further, earning a doctorate in Assyriology, which means that he can read Sumerian cuneiform and can thus investigate the earlier faiths that influenced the formation of the Abrahamic religion and, I think, the invention of the God of Abraham. Dr. Josh, did I get your bio correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you. Is there anything I should add to that, or?
Oh no, I'm just super happy to be back on the show. It's always it's always a lot of fun.
I'm always happy to have you, sir. So let's think about this. 66 books. Right away, there's a problem in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially the question is, so you've established that you're following a particular canon. So, if we're looking at different versions of Christianity, and you've narrowed it down to a particular part of Protestantism, right? Or, I mean, I assume, I don't know much about the gentleman in question here, but I mean, certainly there are other faith traditions that would identify as Christian that would not limit themselves to but 66 books. So, but again, like if we're being gracious, if we're being charitable, I know why he's saying that, but
well, as I remember, I mean, there are a number of other religions that have like the Apocrypha or other things like that. But then when you look at the Old Testament or the New Testament as well, there's places where the Bible refers to other books as if they were part of the Bible, as if they're supposed to be, God's word or part of the same combined compilation. Why would God make reference to other books if they're not part of the. Why would he make reference to books that were not written by God if they're written by men who were not inspired by God? So why are these books not in here? You know, the Book of the Covenant, the Wars of the Lord, the Book of Jasher, Statutes, the Acts of Solomon, and so on. There's over a dozen like that. And then from the New Testament, you've got Paul's epistles to the Corinthians, Ephesians, Laodiceans, and a couple of prophecies, things like, and all of these are removed too. If the Bible makes reference to them, where are they?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously there are apologetic arguments that sort of become Hail Marys, I think, at certain points. But but it all really, I think, comes down to your particular tradition that you have, sort of hitched your wagon to, right? And so once you do, it's okay. Well, these are obviously the correct books. This is the correct canon. And yeah, I mean, so I think the seeming arbitrariness of that. I mean, you can make an argument. Obviously, we're outside of my area of expertise in this with the various early church councils, but you can make this argument that they have this set of criteria that they establish biblical books based on this. But I mean, those are not without problem. And again, every Christian sect that disagrees with those 66 books and thinks they should be more, you'd have to make the argument with them. So it's a problematic thing. There's a lot of this in this quote, this assumption about things like homogeneity or univocality, or it really, in my opinion, becomes quite circular pretty quickly. But I guess we'll
so
see
it's
that.
not just all the different denominations who interpret everything differently. It's that when they're talking about one consistent story, I'm pretty sure the Jews writing their part of the story were not referring to the same story that the New Testament writers were referring to. They're talking about a different story.
Yeah. Again, so I mean, you and I know this, but I think it's good to call it out. So much, if not all, of what's going to be said in this section of his sermon is interpreted through his own theological lens. So this idea that he's putting forward that writers, for example, in the Hebrew Bible had the same story or had in mind things that we see in the New Testament. I mean, these are all just theological interpretations you're reading back into the text, and more problematic that could not be.
So then the next thing about it is that what is about the span of 1600 years? The only way that I know that this can be counted, it's half that long. I mean, what would the earliest works of the Bible were confirmed? How old are they?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously where he's getting this is he's following the periods of time or the statements about chronology in the Bible itself. So like in places like 1 Kings 6, you have a statement about 480 years before, I think it's the dedication of Solomon's temple. That's when the Exodus happened. And so you sort of do the math, and we kind of know when Solomon was supposed to have been. And so you go backwards, and this is where you end up with this sort of traditional date of the Exodus being in the middle of the 15th century. So if you're looking at like a 1450 Exodus, sometime between then and 40 years later is when Moses is supposed to be receiving the law on Mount Sinai. And so, let's just say for round numbers, 1400 BCE is when Moses is given the law. And according to some traditions, everything else in the Pentateuch, right?
From what I understand, what other people tell me is that the Genesis is like post-exilic or likely post-exilic, that it's somewhere around the 5th century BC. And then that the oldest works are like Amos or Hosea, that they're 7th or 8th century BC. Those are the oldest books. And so what are the most recent, before the Bible is complete? What would that be? 2nd century?
Yeah, well, I mean, from the perspective of the Hebrew Bible, I think probably the latest text that we have, at least that's in this canon that we're talking about, would be the book of Daniel, written 165, 164. And there's debate, obviously, about the dating of biblical texts. I think that most people, like mainstream positions, would be something like there are portions, most of them are things like poems or songs that probably go back to Iron One, to maybe the 12th century, maybe the 11th. And so these are things like that would be classified as archaic biblical Hebrew. So Judges chapter 5, Exodus 15, these are Genesis 49. Like these are texts that just themselves, these little units, probably go back in oral form much earlier than when the text starts getting strictly written down and undergoing its redaction history.
I think we talked about this before, where you have these traditions. When they found Ashurbanipal's library, for example, and they find all of these cuneiform texts with perilously similar stories in them, it was easy to see how, if this is the original version of the story, and then we have the fall of the Mesopotamian empires, nobody reads cuneiform anymore, and now we have these stories being told over thousands of campfires, over many generations, maybe 1,000 years or so, before they reinvent syllabic texts effectively. I think that was the Phoenicians that did that. And then over this millennium, you have these stories subtly changing in little ways, as is popular, whatever, until now we get the stories that ended up being written into the Bible, and we can see how they have been derived from the earlier Mesopotamian texts. Am I in the right field here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any question that the writers of the Hebrew Bible are dependent upon the texts that we see in Mesopotamia. And this is part of the issue, I think, that quotes like this 66 books, 3 continents, 1,500 years, blah, blah, blah. The thing that these types of throwaway quotes fall prey to is the assumption that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, for example, in its entirety. And
including the part where he died.
Right, exactly. Or that he
Which
was
is
the most
doubly challenging because he never existed.
It's all a journey, Aaron. But I think once you can move past this type of, a more fundamentalist or very conservative evangelical approach to the text, you can start engaging with actual scholarship on the Pentateuch, right? And so you start to ask questions like, okay, what section of this book of that became the final form of Genesis, let's say, what actually does seem to go back a little bit earlier, and what are later additions and redactions to this text, and where can we tease out? Here we have one version of a flood story, and here we have another version of a flood story. They're kind of been mashed together. How do we piece these, tease these apart? Why is it that we have one creation story in Genesis 1:1 to 2:4, and then, following a redactional layer 2:4b and following, you have the Garden of Eden story, a completely different creation story? Why is that? And you can do the very problematic apologetic, go that apologetic route and say things, like one is a hyper focus of the, Genesis 1 or some bullshit. But the reality is these are two different traditions. And so what that means, I think, and Ronald Hendel, for example, out of Berkeley, has a phenomenal new commentary out on Genesis 1 through 11. And one of the things that I think is really useful is being very specific about this dependency that we see in places like Genesis 1 through 11 in the primeval history on these earlier Mesopotamian texts. right? So, trying to make these apologetic arguments that they all go back to the same flood story or something, it's just so much nonsense, because there are so many direct links. There's shared language. There are blind motifs. There are things that lead scholars in the field, specialists, to go, yeah, I mean, it's like the flood story. They're pulling from Atrahasis. They're pulling from Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Like, that's where they're getting that from. But I think if we can get to that point where we're all recognizing that data point, then we can start to ask the interesting questions of, why is it that Moses and this being put in a reed basket is pulling from the birth legend of Sargon? What does that mean? What are they trying to say here? Those are the interesting questions, not this outdated, the whole book is written by Isaiah. The whole Pentateuch is written by Moses, or some stuff. It's just that's where it becomes uninteresting, and you're completely on the defensive all the time, fighting a losing uphill battle.
I mean, I'm sorry. There's no way, coincidentally, that people, they didn't have the internet back then. They weren't able to communicate and make sure they're all on the same page. It's the very same story of God, his creation of man, man's fall and separation from God, God establishing his holiness, and at the same time setting the plan in motion to ultimately reconcile man back to God through Jesus Christ, the building of the church and the preparing for Jesus to return so that we spend eternity with God. This whole plan is told from 40 different authors over 1,500 years, most of whom didn't even know each other. And they're all telling their own part of the story. That's just not logical to think human minds are going to come up with stuff like that.
Dr. Josh, the authors of the Hebrew Bible, were they telling the story about how they were going to be redeemed through Jesus?
I was waiting for like a question that was going to come and make me think, not make me laugh. No, certainly not. And this idea and this quote, and I actually typed it out here in this Word document and sort of went through it line by line to try to piece together specifically what it is that he actually thinks about these texts. But no, unless he is willing to say that he is foregoing any historical critical method, he's going to set aside any concept of authorial intent, or what did Isaiah write and what did he mean? What did his audience hear? What would have been the intent of that message that was said? If he's going to put all of that aside and say he doesn't care about that, he's just going to look at his interpretation of the New Testament and read the Hebrew Bible with that lens, then fine. Like, he can, live your best life. He can go do that. And then he can say shit like this, right? Because look, Genesis 3, it depicts, Satan, and in 3:15, it talks about how, Jesus is going to defeat the serpent and crushing the head. And like, yeah, okay, fine. But you're only going to get there by taking a big interpretive lens that says the New Testament can tell me, my interpretation of the New Testament can illuminate things that even the writer of the Hebrew, these sections of the Hebrew Bible didn't intend at all, right? I can use this to figure it out. Fine. But that's what you're having to do. And I don't think he's willing to admit that.
Just to be clear here, when you're talking about what they were intending, I mean, the original interpretation of the story was never meant to imply that the serpent was supposed to be Satan.
No. and he, like, this is why, as an Assyriologist, as somebody that really enjoys working with these ancient Near Eastern texts, when you can let go of, when you can pull away this interpretive lens of everything in the Old Testament has to be like foreshadowing of things in the New Testament, you can remove that and actually see the text for what it is. you can make really interesting observations that scholars do all the time. For example, in Genesis 3, right, the serpent, or in Genesis 2, God is lying, right, for their own good. That I think the narrative is trying to get at, but for their own good, Yahweh is lying to Adam and Eve and saying, or to Adam at the time, if you eat of this in the day that you eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you're going to die. But it's a lie, right? They didn't. And so, but this fits perfectly with a theme. And I think actually I think Kip was on, Dr. Davison and I were on, and we talked about this, but you can see this theme in different texts, in different literary texts from Mesopotamia. So in the Adopomyth, in Gilgamesh Tablet 11, you have this theme of the chance at immortality that often is combined either with food or a plant. And they get so close, the human gets so close to gaining eternal life by consuming this plant or this food, and they miss it. And in each case that I'm thinking of here, there is a snake involved in the text, right? There's that motif of this serpent. And like that in and of itself is super interesting, because it's sort of a way that this text is sort of answering, I think, sometimes quite subtly, notions in Mesopotamian texts or in Babylonian concepts. And sometimes it's quite overt. But if you can, that's completely different. I mean, not even close to this idea that, we should be able to look back in Genesis 3 and see the book of Revelation. Like, miss me with that shit. It's just so much nonsense.
When I ask Christians, where does it say that the serpent in the garden was Satan? And they say, well, it says that in Revelations. I'm like, you realize Revelations was not written by the same people that wrote Genesis. And when it says that Satan is that old serpent, that doesn't mean that old serpent, because here he's standing, which he's not supposed to be able to stand, but it says that he's standing, and that he has 7 heads, which I think is a detail that they ought to have brought up in Genesis if, in fact, they were talking about the same thing.
It's this. I mean, look, I think that we can steel man their argument here, right? Because we understand it. Like, you and I understand what it is that they're doing. They believe that their canon is divinely inspired, that God is the ultimate author of this entire collection of books. And so, in spite of it being composed in their minds by this disparate group of men over a millennium and a half, it is, despite all that distance and time and geography between them all, the reason that there is this continuity in their minds through the interpretive lens that they have is that God is the author. There are lots of assumptions in that. And this is the big problem that I see with his argument here. And I'm not a philosophy guy. I'm not a logician. So, I'm not going to lay this out perfectly, I'm sure. But it seems quite circular to me to say, we know that the Bible is of divine origin because look at the homogeneity or the univocality in all of these disparate books by these various people. Well, how do you know there's univocality? Well, because it's divinely inspired. And so through that interpretive lens that I'm using, I use the New Testament and read stuff back into the Old Testament. So it's assuming divine authorship to prove divine authorship. And that doesn't seem like a very good, like that would be circular reasoning, right? It's not a very good way to make an argument. It wouldn't look really good in premise conclusion form, right? That syllogism would look bad. So that's the big issue that I see here.
His final argument for the veracity of the Bible is
it's the #1 selling book in the entire world,
which to me means nothing more than Christianity was dominant in the society where the printing press was invented.
I love the version of this argument that is, look at how long Christianity has been running. I mean, my God, it's 2,000 years, right? And what I like to say in those situations is, well, man, Sumerian and Akkadian religion must have been really true, right? Because, a version of Sumerian religion went for 3 millennia. And so would it have been a sound argument in the middle of the first millennium BCE to say, well, we know that Enlil and An and Enki or Ea, these are all the true deities, ones that we should be worshiping, because look at how long this Sumerian and Mesopotamian religion has been running. No, all right. It's of course not. That's what a ridiculous notion. And popularity does not then thus, it doesn't necessarily follow that because something is popular, it's true. And I think about the Battle of Mons, and I don't know that I've talked about that with you, but that World War I Battle of Mons, where the British sort of fought off a fighting retreat, or they engaged in a fighting retreat with the Germans, and following this horrific battle where the British, it was assumed like it had to be something special that they survived it and were able to hold off the Germans the way that they did. It started to circulate very early that angels had delivered the British, and these angelic beings that were holding bows and arrows. There are different versions of it that came from people that said that to have been on the battlefield. But this became international. I mean, thousands and thousands, talking about reporting on you. I mean, you can even today. And what's so bad about this is that it became international news. And the guy that started the whole thing going was a guy named Machen. He wrote this piece in the paper and intended it. It was a fiction. This story about the Angel of Mons was a fiction, but he didn't. The way that he wrote it, I guess it was understood by people that read it as not a fiction, and so it just spread like wildfire. And I think it was a year after this all started, he publicly went forward and said, "Hey, it was a fiction." And they, nope, you're wrong. This actually happened. There's a book today where the author is investigating still. What can we say about the veracity of this, this miracle claim? I mean, so, popularity, the speed at which something, a story developed, a miracle claim developed. Again, we're not in my area of expertise at all here. But there were this eyewitness testimony that you can find. I don't think that many of the people that would argue for something like a minimal facts, of the resurrection, would also argue for a minimal facts of the angels of Mons, right? I don't think they're going to do that. And so I just think that these are arguments that grasp at straws. What could we possibly argue in favor of our position? Well, look at how popular it is. Look, it's the best-selling book.
Yeah, and the number 2, if I remember correctly, was quotations from Chairman Mao.
My God.
All right. Well, Dr. Josh, thank you so much for coming on and helping with this. I'm having a lot of fun with this project.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's lots of fodder here.